Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. What do you do when you're triggered? A very dear friend of mine recently said something extremely wise when I was triggered and called her to talk about this. She said, every time we're triggered is an opportunity to grow and learn about ourselves. Well, of course it is. What a wise thing to say. And yet, that is not something that immediately I wanted to hear because I was still mad at what was triggering me. We all have things that trigger us. The first thing is to identify what is it that triggers you? What bothers you? And then potentially, if you want to go deeper, dive into why you think that is. Where do you think that came from? My example recently, without getting too detailed, is that somebody told me I should do something. And I want to say this a little bit more specifically because I know there's still some cases of COVID that are out there, and my condolences to anybody that has it because I've had it twice and it is not fun. But the other day, I had a head cold and I was going to go out with a group of people. And I remember saying, I'm not sure if I'm going to make it because I have a head cold, but I'll let you know tonight if I can make it for the next day, if I feel better. Well, somebody wrote back in a text string, hey, if no, it was, you should stay home and get rest. Well, that didn't sit so well with me. I didn't do anything with it. I know that this person cares deeply about me, and that was the intent. But I think there might have been something underlying that, which is why I would have preferred that the person simply say, Karen, I'm not comfortable with you coming, even though you might feel better. You still just got over a head cold, and I don't feel comfortable with that. Would you mind staying home? That would have been much more direct. So as I talk about this, I'm realizing that there's really two things that we're talking about here. One is when you're triggered with something, because somebody else might not have been triggered by that at all. They would have said, oh, how nice. That's so great that she cares and wants me to stay home and rest. Someone like me immediately gets triggered and I start feeling controlled because I don't want somebody telling me what to do. And that all comes back to my childhood where I felt like if I were controlled, that wasn't a good thing. And I think most of us don't want to be in control, or no, most of us don't want to be controlled because we want to be in control. And stick with me here as far as this hyper analysis at the moment. There is a point of this. It's really important to know what triggers you because this also directly relates to potentially avoiding a conversation and not leaning into something that could potentially feel like a conflict situation. And yet it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. Now, my first knee jerk reaction was to start writing her back and saying, I appreciate your love and care for me. And I would really like you to be direct. If you are not comfortable with me being there, please just tell me that. That's what I wanted to say. I didn't. I'm learning more about not reacting, and that is working for me. So if you are somebody that tends to react, I would also recommend that you take a moment to sit with something rather than immediately responding. And that served me really well because, in the grand scheme of things, this person I care deeply about, and I know she cares deeply about me. So, is it really something to bring up right now? I don't see that as a need. If it became a pattern, and she continually told me, air quotes, what I should do, then I would say something because that to me is a bigger issue. And because we're good friends, it would be important for me to tell her that because that then is taking ownership of my needs. And we have to take ownership of our needs with what would be most helpful for other people in their interactions with us to help us to have good relationships, all of the above there. Really, it all goes back to having good relationships and communicating well and clearly. So let's look at it from the other perspective. How interesting that, or another perspective, that from her side, I'm guessing she was feeling that she really cared. And she said that it was probably a pattern for her to say, oh, you should do this, even though that didn't work for me. And I would have rather had her be direct. This is something that all of us would be good for all of us to think about, to say, am I being direct or am I using some form of passivity to get my message across? And I can tell you, being from the land of 10,000 lakes, Minnesota is my original home state. There is a lot of passivity there, and it's all about being kind and accommodating others. But the challenge is, as Brene Brown says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Too often, we think that we're being accommodating. We think that we're trying to be, again, air quotes, nice and polite. And yet, what's happening is we are causing some friction in our relationships because we're not direct. And sometimes it's hard to know what people mean. For example, have you ever been in a group of friends where you want to go have dinner and somebody says, oh, where do you want to go for dinner? And the other people go, oh, I don't care. Where do you want to go? Well, where do you want to go? And all of a sudden, nobody cares, but truly everybody does care a little bit. And you end up at a restaurant that nobody really wanted to go to. That has happened to the best of us. One of my favorite stories with my mom was when I was back home in Minnesota at the time when she was alive, driving her to, well, obviously she was alive if I was driving her. Oh, mom, I hope you get a kick out of that wherever you are listening. But if we were in the car driving her to a doctor's appointment and we were at a T in the road, and I didn't know where her doctor was. I had a general idea, but I didn't know exactly how to get there. And I said, okay, mom, is it right or left? And all she said was, well, you might want to turn right. I'm thinking, wait, what? I might want to turn right, but I could turn left. What's funny, and so I started laughing. We both were laughing. I said, okay, I'm going to turn right. Clearly, that's the way you would recommend I go. Now, I did find out later I could have turned left and still gotten to that doctor's appointment, but right was the more efficient route that she wanted to take. So that was pretty funny. But these things happen a lot, or we do things because we're trying to be polite with someone. And yet, what we end up doing is confusing people. Another one I would say is sometimes we want to give someone to something to someone that perhaps we think they would enjoy, and we maybe don't really want it. So we're trying to pawn it off on them and be nice. And yet it isn't really coming across as nice. So let me be clearer here. I remember witnessing someone giving a food item who had brought it to another person, said, hey, thank you so much for this. It was at a party. Basically, they brought some food, and I knew that the person didn't really want the food, but she was saying, oh, you take it with you. And then the other person said, no, 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 you need food in the house. You can eat that, and then you'll have food for the rest of the week. And then the other person goes, no, no, but if you take it, you made it. I don't want to take your food from you because you made it. I'm sure you could eat it. And they went back and forth like this, and I pretty much pulled my hair out. I wish that I had laughed at the time because it really was funny when you think about it. But at the time, it was more frustrating of, oh my gosh, would you just say what you want? If you don't want it, I understand we want to be polite and that, but there does come a point where you could be really direct and say, I really enjoyed the food while we were here at the party. But the truth is, I really would rather not have it here on hand, or something a little bit more straightforward and direct rather than having you come across like you are trying to pawn it off on someone else because it's so amazing and you're not just being clear with what you want. So it's so fascinating how these nuances can get in the way of our communication and often our relationships. Now, granted, I am in a position where I'm fascinated by this stuff. It's definitely something that I analyze a lot. But I would say my action for you today is, first of all, be mindful of the word should. I did a whole episode on the word should at one point in time, but it was a while ago. And it came up again when that person said, you should do this. I'm thinking, well, who are you to tell me what I should do? Be careful about
should, the word, generally speaking, the root of it is shame. It's essentially saying that this is something that's not okay, or this is a standard that you need to, or standard or expectation that you need to uphold, which really has nothing to do with you as the person saying the word should. What that other person should or should not do is totally up to them. And it really isn't about should or shouldn't. It's about what is actually happening. I like to think of it as, what do you want to do? What do you need to do, rather than what you should do? I also wouldn't go around, though, telling people what they need to do, because nobody likes unsolicited advice. As a matter of fact, that was the name of that episode, something around unsolicited advice. Be mindful of your words, be careful, and be careful about your intent. Are you really caring for them when you say should, or is it something that where you're just trying to avoid something that you don't want to be direct about? Those are some things that I would invite you to think about this week and ask yourself, am I being direct in my communication? And am I making requests rather than telling people what to do or suggesting what they do? That's another thing. Making requests is really important to think about. What is it that you need? And by the way, usually when there is something in us that's unrest, where there's an unrest, oftentimes, let's think about this from the perspective of a complaint. You're complaining about something, you're frustrated, you're talking about it, you're venting about it. Under every complaint is a longing. My suggestion for you is to think about, when you are complaining or venting or frustrated and you're saying those things out loud, ask yourself, what is the longing that then I can ask of another person to get my needs met? Because maybe belonging, let's say you're frustrated. So for me, like in this case, I was frustrated where I felt controlled by her saying, well, you should stay home. Well, who are you to tell me to stay home? If I feel better, I'm going to go. But maybe the bigger issue is, you don't want me to be there because you're worried that I'm going to cause you to catch something. I totally understand that. That would have been much more logical to hear. But a lot of times we are not bringing these things to the forefront. We're not actually saying what we need. So if there is a longing, like in my case, my longing would be to not be controlled. So perhaps, again, like I told you, I chose not to say anything because it isn't a theme at this point. But if it is, it did become a theme, I would say, hey, you know what? Let's call her Susie Q. Susie Q, you know that I love you and I know that you love me and we care deeply about each other. I've noticed that you sometimes use the word should with me, and that makes me feel like you're trying to control me. And I know this is not about you. This is me. It's a trigger that I have. And I would prefer that if there's a request that you want to make of me, that you simply ask and make the request rather than telling me what I should do. So that's an example of what you could potentially say. I know today was a little bit of a mishmash of different things based on a personal experience that I had, but I do hope that it gave you some tips and certainly something that you might be relating to in your own personal or professional life. So, on that note, let us ask for what we need, avoid the word should. And by the way, also to ourselves, you shouldn't should yourself either. And if we can be kind and have grace for ourselves, and we are direct with ourselves, but also make sure that we're kind. I know I said that twice, but that's very important. Then we're going to simply have better relationships with others and as well with ourselves. And we'll have unshakable confidence, which is what I want everybody to have in their communication. By the way, if you liked these tips or others that I provide, I would love for you to think about whether you're interested in me as a speaker. I would love to come to your event or a conference, or if you know somebody, I would absolutely be thrilled to have a conversation with them. You can hit me up in the links here in the episode, or you can simply email me directly at Karen@KarenLaus.com.
And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.